Evolutionary.org presents Evolutionary Hardcore Podcast with your co-hosts, Steve from the American Underground and Mobster from the UK Iron Den. Get ready for the most hardcore and underground info in the industry. And here we go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
Evolutionary.org Hardcore Podcast coming your way. 163. This is the post Mr. Olympia Big Ramy episode. Stevesmi here and the Mobster joining me. How's it going?
Good. Let's smash this one out of the park while it's current and hot, people.
So, guys, let's go over to 2021 Mr. Olympia results. We're going to go over those. We're going to talk about Big Ramy. We've already done a couple podcasts on him, but he's once again the champion. So we're going to do another one. He's worth as many podcasts as necessary. He's earned it. And then we're going to talk about his steroid cycle. We're going to talk a little bit also about Mr. Olympia and kind of brush you up on that. So it's going to be a fun podcast. So first off, let's go over the top 6 finishers. William Bonac with 60 points. Nicholas Walker, 49 points. Hunter Labrada, 40 points. Hadi Choopan, 29 points. Brandon Curry, 19 points. And it was a very close win for Big Ramy, who got 12 points. So really, really tight. The year prior, Mobster, Ramy was 13 points and Curry was 28 points. So it was a little bit of a wider number. And then Phil Heath was really close third at 31. And Hadi was a really close fourth with 32. And then you had William Bonac and then Akeem Williams. So, you know, most of these same classic characters. Nicholas Walker jumped up to 5th place. And then you had William Bonac, who dropped one spot down to 6th. So, and he went from 48 points to 60 points. And then Hunter Labrada jumped up from 8th place with 78 points. And he jumped up all the way to 4th with 40 points. So he did much better as well. And then you had, of course, Hadi going from 4th to 3rd. So it was a very interesting Mr. Olympia. What do you think? Was there any surprises here? Maybe, and talk a little bit about the point system, because in most sports, the more points you get, the more you win. So the points, explain how the point system works and explain your thoughts on these finishes. Any surprises?
Right, so let's deal with the points first. The point system in bodybuilding for competition, but interestingly, slightly different for rankings to help you qualify for the Mr. Olympia. So, for example, Ramy would have the least amount of points, which suggests, of course, that the lower number of points is the higher the placing. And that's it in a nutshell. What they do is, if you've got a big competition of 20 or 30 athletes, and sometimes we've had that 20 odd athletes for the Olympia, they simplified it. So everybody from 15 on down is 16th place. Sometimes people like to know if that's different, and we'll try to look at the scorecards. But for argument's sake, that's pretty much keeps it simple. The other thing that they do with regards to points, and they've done for years with these kind of competitions, and there's little tweaks here and there, but the last time I looked, they throw out the high and low scores. So, for example, you shouldn't get people over-clicking on favorites or over-marking someone, and a head judge can come in and throw out the high and low scores quite easily, especially if it looks like there's things not quite working how they should, and perhaps obviously judges make mistake and there's little tweaks that need to be done there. That's their judge's job. So that's the thing. You also typically have someone else who tallies the scores separately, independent of the judges and independent of the head judge, and then you go over and everybody checks it together. So that's something. What is interesting, funny enough, and I looked this up at the same time, is that there's a different way of scoring for qualifying. So some of the lads we know in this competition, Roll is a good example, didn't qualify until the last minute. Other people, like James Holland said, qualified last year. And it was very much a case of, right, so how does that work? Does that person have the least amount of points coming in over the season? For example, entering 4 competitions and perhaps winning 4 competitions, they'd only have 4 points. So no, that's scored slightly differently. And then, of course, that way of scoring things differently can confuse people, and then you get arguments about the scoring system. As far as surprises, I mean, this is one of those things. We know bodybuilding is very much a matter of opinion. It's a bit like the perfection in ice skating or gymnastics or something like this sometimes, insofar as we have our own personal favorites, the kind of build that we prefer. Judges are human, they do the same thing again. And I will agree with some of the comments that we've seen online and other podcasts already, in that Ramy's condition, overall shape, etc., last year was slightly better. One of the comments that's been made is that Ramy looked like he did a couple of years ago when he was playing second and third and fourth and so on. And that Brandon Curry certainly in the pre-judging looked like the better overall bodybuilder in terms of condition. So, interestingly enough, Bonek down at 6th place, having dropped, as you say, I think it was 49 to 60 points, you said. Was his arriving late an issue? I think he was one of those guys. We've talked about this before, you and I, Steve, when we say getting the overseas athletes into America, settled, with the right food, with the access to decent gyms, potentially on site in Florida as it was this year, back to Las Vegas next year. Having those issues resolved, for example, Hadi and Ramy both in the country for several weeks ahead of the Mr Olympia, makes a difference. And Bonek, I believe he was, again, bearing in mind, he's only coming from Europe, had that issue. So he's only arriving in the country, I think, just over a week ahead of schedule. And we know that that makes a difference. Flying makes a difference. Stress makes a difference. So there's that as well. What else are we looking at here in terms of places, etc.? Remind me. Let's have a quick look. Okay, so one of the things that I made a note of, and something else that had been thrown out there as an opinion, was sponsorship. Does sponsorship at the Olympia, with the, for example, the screens behind the athletes, throwing up sponsor names while they're competing, while they're judging, does that affect potentially the outcome? And a good example of that, where the argument has been thrown in, was for Hunter Labrada. Labrada was a sponsor. Ramy this year sponsored by Enhanced, for example, Enhanced Labs. So you go, is that an argument right there? Equally, and you and I are going to touch on this a little bit more in a minute, where we talk about the Middle Eastern influence. And for example, and this is one of those things where bodybuilding doesn't seem to be biased. There are lots of arguments about racism in certain sports and who wins and so on and so forth. We've had black athletes winning, or Afro-Caribbean, in the case of Brandon Curry. We've had other Afro-Caribbean again with regards to the ethnicity, for example, Ronnie Coleman. So, and now, of course, we're getting in the top three the same again, and 2 Middle Eastern athletes. So bodybuilding especially doesn't seem to have that as an issue. But again, arguably, support from the Middle East, which included Brandon training out in Oxygen again, the Middle East and Asian market influence for overall a potential income, and a lot of athletes going out to train there. If you're a sheikh and you've got a great deal of money, you and I discussed an athlete before who believe I stayed amateur for years because quite simply was being employed by one of the royal families at a wage or a salary that was equivalent to winning the Mr Olympia. So it's interesting to look at that kind of stuff and see how it goes or whatever else. But like I said, bodybuilding is really one of those, you pick who you like and then everybody disagrees, and that happens all the time. I mean, because as a passionate supporters, for example, of Ramy coming from Egypt, it's not unusual if you post a comment online in your Instagram feed or whatever else, disagreeing with perhaps with Ramy's win, to get death threats in Arabic, etc., etc. So it's a fun thing for us to do. I think you and I, especially with other sports, football here and pro football, American football in the States where you are, the armchair opinions can be quite vigorous, shall we say. And so it's one of those things. I would have chosen Brandon myself based on the prejudging for sure. But it's been said again and again and again, if you're already Mr Olympia, it's very difficult to get past that, and you need a kind of knockout blow. So we've seen that a couple of times. Ronnie and Jay Cutler, for example. Ronnie was okay, but Jay was just on point the year that he took that title off of Ronnie. So it's very much that kind of stuff. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, and it looks like 3 out of the top 13 finishers were from Egypt, including Big Ramy. And then you had one from who was Persian, who was Iranian. So that's 4 in the top 13. So yeah, so we're seeing a trend. And what's interesting about Big Ramy is even though he's from Egypt, he actually lives and trains in Kuwait. And a lot of pro bodybuilders now, they are in that part of the world. Dubai is very big hotspot with bodybuilding. And, that's a lot of that has to do with, it's one of those things where that's the sport that they've gravitated to. That's a sport that they've done well in. It's just the physiques, from the Middle East region. It's that size, it's the stockiness, it's that gift for bodybuilding that allows them to do very well. They're not going to be great basketball players. They're not going to be necessarily great soccer players. They're not the fastest, they don't have the endurance. So there's a lot of factors in play here as why bodybuilding is growing. Also the laws are very loose when it comes to steroids over there. So it's not like you go to jail for buying or using steroids. So I think those factors contribute to why you see bodybuilding growing in that part of the world. And then with the Big Ramy influence, you're going to start seeing a lot more of this because people are like, damn, maybe I do have the genetics and the ability to do this. So yeah, chime in that, Mobster, and we're going to get into the Big Ramy's background.
Yeah, I mean, something you and I have discussed off air and indeed on the forums is this: the Asian and specifically the Middle Eastern markets and the support. I mean, there's a couple of things here which differ perhaps from the Europe and from the American stuff, from the West, so to speak. So, for example, it's a very macho, male-orientated, women might say misogynist environment. So men specifically are fated, especially if you're an athlete. It's a thing for, I believe, especially in the Middle East, again, you show your support in this particular way, and something that you and I are aware of, which not everybody that listens to this podcast is aware of, for the support from the government, which we've discussed before. We talked about Ramy's win last year involved 300 to 400 people at the airport, a double-decker bus with a laminate wrap with his face on it. And essentially went to see the president. I think he went to see the Minister of Sport and stuff like that. This stuff doesn't happen in America. It doesn't happen in the UK. A bodybuilder, I think, I'm trying to think with Dorian Yates visited Downing Street or not. I think he did after he won. So he wasn't fated with Tony Blair or whoever was in charge when he was winning the Mr Olympia. He wasn't invited to Downing Street or Buckingham Palace as a top professional bodybuilder. It's only, I believe, as his influence in bodybuilding overall, and after he retired, that he was fated in any way at all, Hall of Fame and all that kind of stuff. So the Asian market, and specifically the Middle East, we've talked about, I think there's a combination of factors here, right? So as you've already discussed, the laws allow bodybuilders there and any supporters of bodybuilders there to have very reasonable access to drugs. It's not. I think even in the Muslim faith, it's kind of almost allowed versus alcohol, which is not. So it's kind of a strange situation there. But and of course the money. Quite simply, if you've got an amazing gym that's worth several millions of pounds, several millions of dollars, easy access to over-the-counter pharmaceutical drugs, peptides, etc., and then a supportive influence. Where, for example, in Iran, where Hadi comes from, they will cook you food in the gym. It is something that they want to do. It's almost like, my gift to you is to cook you this steak, and God allows me to do this for you. And I want my faith, my support, my family. I can afford to cook you this steak. My family can afford to pay for this steak, and this will be my gift to you to help you win. Imagine going to your local gym, Steve, training, and then the gym says, Steve, you're great, we love you. Here's a protein meal before you leave, as opposed to you having to do this stuff yourself, or meal prep, or having a shake or whatever. That kind of support, that level of support. And then, of course, the guys, which includes second place Brandon, going out there for 3-4 months at a time, Rowley, etc., going out there for 3-4 months at a time. And where we've talked about it before, it's almost like being a prize horse, a stallion, insofar as that everything is done for you. If you haven't eaten a meal and the person that's helping you comes to the room where you're crashing and you're sleeping between training and everything else, the guys are pretty much video games and talking to their families online via Zoom. And then the guy will come to the room and say, oh, you haven't eaten meal number 4. Don't worry, that's down there. I'll make sure you get a fresh one in the next 10, 15 minutes. That kind of vibe, that level of support has to make a difference. And of course, we're talking about genetic superiors again. So you have this ability to recover, great access to drugs, huge support, fantastic food. I mean, Steve, how can you not do well in that environment? Your only issue is perhaps getting homesick. That's it. And I'm assuming, especially with sponsorship support, etc., as well, and fulfilling your obligations there, you're essentially getting paid to train to eat in just about the best environment as possible. And damn if it ain't hot as well. You're not suffering with the cold and wet and windy weather. It seems sort of what we used to think of the ideal back down in California and Venice Beach, as good a time as it's possibly to have and a great environment as it's possibly to have. And that seems to be a massive, or making a massive difference. You also refer to the stature. Ramy's on the big side, but most Middle Eastern bodybuilders are the right height for bodybuilding, 5'8", 5'9", 5'10". And something I made a note of was, I believe there was an interview done with Hadi's coach, where, no, actually it was with an Egyptian athlete, and the Egyptian athlete turned around and said that the influence that Ramy had meant that this year, through all the divisions and all the classes, I think it was either 17 or 19 Middle Eastern and or Egyptian athletes were attending the competition. That's across all the classes. That is a large percentage of Egyptians. For even if you said there were several hundreds of athletes, that is a lot of Egyptians, a lot of Middle Eastern athletes competing across the class, way more than last year. I think last year the figure was like 4 or 5 or something like that. So it's tripled and then some. And that's the influence again that the Middle Eastern, the Asian market is having on bodybuilding as a whole. It's good even for the American, European, Western market, because it means more money is coming in, more people are competing, bigger competitions. Back to you, Steve.
So let's get over Ramy's early life and how he kind of grew into bodybuilding. He was born in September 1984. He was born into a family of fishermen. He worked as a fisherman until 2010. And then he met up with a guy named Bader Bodai, who was owner of Oxygen Gym. And with his help, and also with Dennis James' help, professional bodybuilder, he stepped on stage 2012 Amateur Olympia at 286 pounds, and he won his IFBB Pro card. He was given the nickname Big Ramy for putting on over 100 pounds just after 2 years of weight training. So no doubt the guy had a gifted ability to put on size. What an amazing opportunity to do that. A lot of people don't have that opportunity around the world. They never get the opportunity to lift weights or play sports and all that stuff. So he found the right person who led him in the right way. So from there, once he turned pro, he got in 2013 Mr. Olympia, already up to 8th place, top 10, a very impressive. He also won the New York Pro Championship that year. Next year, he won it again, New York Pro Championship, and he got 7th at the Mr. Olympia. 2015, he got 1st at the Arnold Classic Brazil, and he got 5th at Mr. Olympia. So he was really on a trajectory to improve. And the next year, he got 4th at Mr. Olympia. And then in 2017, Mobster, guess what happened? He got 2nd at Mr. Olympia. So each year he improved. He couldn't beat Phil Heath that year. He got 6th the next year. And then in 2020, he came back with a vengeance, 1st place. And then in 2021, once again, 1st place. So we'll have to see if he decides to go for a 3-peat next year, or if Brandon Curry wants to get his revenge on him. We'll have to see. Brandon Curry may fall back, and we may see some of these other young guns like Hadi Chupan and Nicholas Walker and those guys make their way back up. And watch out also for Akeem Williams. He also made top 10. He was in 9th place this year. And last year he was in the top 6. So watch out for him as well. Mobster, you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I've noticed in 2017 he was working with Chris Cormier. And in fact, what's happened, as we're well aware, and I've touched on it at the beginning, in the last couple of years, he's been working with Dennis James, who's still a lump, who's, as we say over in the UK, still looks like a bodybuilder. And in fact, he self said that he doesn't seem to be able to get under 240 pounds. He's missed meals. He doesn't do supplements, and he's still a big old boy himself. But one of the things I think Dennis did, possibly more than Chris did, and certainly more, it would seem, than the people helping him in Kuwait, was that Dennis basically wasn't letting him get away with any shit. That's to put it crudely. So, sometimes what can happen, in fact, let me just deal with the drugs very, very quickly. I've been in a fortunate position when I was kicking ass in my competitions, what people like to support a winner. And so the idea is sometimes with regards to drugs, whether it's supplements, drugs, training equipment, etc. And this possibly is something that Ramy said as well, again in Kuwait, where, this guy's good. He's good. I think he's going to win. Let me give him a gift. Let me give him some steroids. Let me give him some bits, peptides, whatever else. And that's just as a winner, just as somebody they think's going to win. Hence, possibly he was already working in that gym when he went from 200 to 280 pounds and was starting to see it as an Olympian, starting to see as a future champion. So there's an issue there, and that particular result, what I think happened perhaps around that time, and something, and you and I discussed the idea that he might be distracted, which I think he was for the first 3 months of his 2020 win, is that he was allowed the distractions. He was allowed to take his foot off the gas a little bit in Kuwait, and going over to America last year with a shorter period of time and coming to America this year with a longer period of time under Dennis James, arguably should have, and we can get into the whether, as I say already, whether he should have won or shouldn't have won, and arguing about Brown and Curry, etc. Dennis doesn't let him take his foot off the gas. Dennis is on him, when he's awake in the morning to when he goes to sleep at night time. And one of the comments last year we saw when he was in better condition, arguably, came to the States ahead of time and was talking about posing sometimes 3, 4, 5 times a day, sometimes 20 minutes, and I believe up to an hour towards the end, and complaining about it. And Dennis says, do you want to be number one? Do you want to be the winner? Then you're going to pose. And that was it. There was no argument. And maybe that's the relationship that you need. It's like kind of something out of the Rocky film. You need your fella in your corner who does not let up. He's on your back 24/7, 365. He doesn't bullshit you. He doesn't say you look good when you don't. If none of that happens, and he makes you get to the very edge of that place that you need to be in order to win. And I suspect that Dennis James versus the Chris Cormier was a change 2017 to 2020, 2021. Perhaps again, there was this, we can talk about perhaps a tiny bit of water underneath the skin, that little bit of a polish that was missing, and so on and so forth. But again, it's one of those things. I mean, you and I, and many of our listeners, I'm sure, will always discuss for fun the ideal situation to make someone who has the potential to be a great athlete. How do they become a great athlete? What is it? You and I, for example, said it's very rarely a rich person. Poor people seem to have more hunger. So then you've got that. Then you need your genetics. You really need a coach that doesn't fuck around. And I think Dennis is there. You really need, as in Chad Nichols, for example, one of, if not the prep coach in terms of that side of things, in terms of what we call special supplements, as the bodybuilders sometimes euphemistically, we call them PEDs, of course. You need someone who's on point there. And that's combination of factors should have you super duper lean, super duper in shape, in the country ahead of time, and looking and acting and being a champion. Something very, very quickly, and in fact reminded me of this element of being a champion. A lot of athletes at the Mr Olympia, especially in the press conference, where this year they were brought out on stage in pairs and 2s and 3s, and a lot of the athletes were wearing the jackets that are provided for the athletes. But a couple of athletes, 2 athletes specifically, that stuck in my mind, was Brandon Curry and our winner, Ramy. And they both turned up suited and booted, Steve, looking like champions, not wearing a hoodie, not covered in sponsor logos or whatever else, but come in there like professionals, super lovely ties, silk suits, great leather shoes, and acting like men that had their business ready to rock and roll. And of course, showing you nothing of their physiques, leaving no special peaks. We've seen next to nothing of Ramy in the run up to the Olympia, wearing a t-shirt, people trying to guess whether he's vascular, whether he's lean, whether his waist was small, covered up with maybe just his arms, his forearms, and the bottom of his upper arms exposed. And that was it. There was no 10 million photographs on Instagram, all that kind of stuff. What do you think, Steve?
All right. Yep. I definitely, yeah, I agree with that, Mobster. That's good analysis for sure. So, let's talk a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about his social media. And Mobster, tell us about his training, because everyone wants to know what kind of training this guy is doing. Is it anything different from a year ago? Basically, he's got 3.6 million followers just on Instagram. So, And if you look at his Instagram page, he's got pictures of himself. He's got pictures, inspirational stuff. He's got pictures of food. Got a lot of followers, especially from the Arab world. You look at the comments, a lot of them in Arabic. And so he's got a huge following all around, from Turkey to the UAE to Saudi Arabia to Jordan, all the way west into Morocco and Egypt. So he's got a huge following across the Middle East. So I'm sure his followers will be continuing to grow. He's becoming a legend, and that part of the world. And he's becoming a household name. We talked about it on the previous podcast we did, how important that is. Another thing that's interesting too, when you have that many followers, you have that many, that's an opportunity from a business standpoint. These supplement companies need to start hiring people who speak the language, who can travel to that part of the world, because there's a huge market in that part of the world for bodybuilding coming up. So if you're a supplement company and you're not getting in on that, you're basically missing the boat, and you're going to regret it. You're going to regret it. And 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you're going to look back and be like, what the heck happened here? Because bodybuilding in the United States is not growing, but over there it's growing like crazy. So if you ask a normal person in the United States who won Mr. Olympia, they're not going to know who won Mr. Olympia. No one cares. You know what people were doing on Sunday? They're watching NFL. They're watching football. That's what people do in America. We don't care about bodybuilding, but over there, he's a household name. You ask people who won Mr. Olympia, they'll know. They'll know who won Mr. Olympia. So your supplement company, you better get on the action over there. You better be hiring people who speak the language and who can translate.
I'll jump in here very quickly, Steve. The markets, Steve and I talked about this in the pre-show. If you're not in this market, you're missing a trick. You really are. China, with all the goods that we're getting into the West, America, Europe, and here in the UK, is monumental, even with the restrictions of COVID, etc. At the time this podcast has been recorded, easing up just a little bit. It's still taking time to get over here. However, it means that there's more income for the Chinese producers, for the fellas working in the factories and making those businesses, more Chinese billionaires. And then, of course, you've got India and Pakistan and, of course, Arabia. And the biggest middle class in the world, I believe, is in India. Something ridiculous like educated, college, etc. 800 million, some stupid number. If the US is around 350, 360, the UK, I think, is about 70 million. And then you've got a middle class or an educated class in India of 800 million, Steve. So if you just run the numbers, if it's 10% that exercise and it's 1/10 of the 10% that are consider themselves bodybuilders, you're talking about across those two countries, it's 2.5 billion. You're still talking about a potential market of 210 million people lifting weights and thinking of themselves as bodybuilders who need sports supplements. So you need to get into that. And that's how big this market is. Training. Okay, so there's two factors here. There is an interesting thing which I've seen about the Arabian side of stuff back in Kuwait again, in terms of the training. It tends towards, in an ideal situation, and especially if the man is hungry, which I'll get onto in a second, of a slightly higher volume in terms of repetition range, and probably around 60-70% of your 1 rep max. Ideal bodybuilding, and is typically 8 to 12 reps and about 80% every 1 rep max. But for example, when you look at some of the workout routines that are being discussed and revealed, it's 15, 16, 17 repetitions. So it's a higher repetition. You're building up a decent muscle fiber type, and perhaps obviously the support that PEDs give you allow for that kind of training with that moderately high percentage of your 1 rep max producing capillary expansion. So you're getting those kind of big blown up bodybuilder type muscles. They might look a little bit soft, and then you rely on perhaps diuretics, etc., which we'll get to in a little while, to dry the athlete out. So there's that. What's also, as I said before, if you look, as we discussed in the previous podcast, where what Dennis was doing to Ramy was he wasn't letting up again. So there was, I think, one that stuck in my mind was the tricep workout, where it looked like they planned to do 8 or 12 reps. But I think it was one of those, my coach is bullshitting me, because as soon as he got the 12 reps, it was another 4 reps, and Ramy was in pain, and you could see that he was in pain. And they did a drop set, and then they went straight over to something else and hit another angle. I think it was some sort of cable 1-arm press down or push down, something like this. And it was one thing after another, and the sweat was coming off Ramy, the veins were popping on him, but of course he was doing what needed to be done. So it was interesting in that particular way. I think if you look at the leg training, for example, Ramy uses some really, really big weights on some of the leg exercises, but I'm reminded of the Rolly workout, Rolly Winkler, similar workouts, possibly because we're using a similar coach over in Kuwait again, where again, it's one thing after another. So there's giant sets, there's drop sets. And again, we're talking about pre-competition training here, Steve. On that, and something that you and I have discussed before, is the potential, which we did in the previous show. I think something that might have harmed Ramy's condition this year a little bit was the sheer amount of things that he had to do as a quote-unquote famous Arabian Egyptian bodybuilder, and all the things that we've previously discussed already, is that there were so many opportunities, so many things to do, that sometimes Mr. Olympias will take a few weeks, even up to 3 months off. Ronnie and Dexter Jackson, for example. But one of the things I said to you, what I thought was going to happen to Ramy, and I believe did happen to Ramy, is that there was so much going on, so many things to do. I think it was longer than 3 months. So the argument about training here might well be that you need, as a top athlete, doing the absolute best you possibly can in your chosen sport, a certain amount of time off when you've peaked, a certain amount of easing off the gas before you go back at it again. I'm thinking perhaps Ramy had a little bit too much. We didn't really see anything coming out of, in terms of the news, etc. Ramy for probably 4, maybe 5 months. And it's only with the late competitions, the closest the Olympia and the Arnold were together, etc., that we started to see a build up with the excitement. We started to see a build up with interest in the competitions. And I'm going to say that was about 5 months. So that's 7 months from winning last year's Mr. Olympia till we started to see photographs, till we started to see training. Think about the opportunities here that we've already discussed. We're saying about the Asian market, we're saying about the Arabian market, China, etc. If you're the Mr. Olympia, just how many opportunities, how many interviews, how many reporters, how many TV discussions did you go on? How many different companies wanted to see you and offer sponsorship deals or something like this? How many paid viewings did you go? How many different gyms do you get to visit, etc.? Sometimes too many, sometimes too much. Did that make a difference? That's a point I'm going to make. Did that make a difference? Perhaps Dennis James doing his absolute best, Chad doing his absolute best, and the argument that one of the comments I think come out of RX, he looked his absolute best only the last 5 minutes of the show as that last bit of water came out. So it's one of those things. Did his physique look different? Did he have the condition he could have done? And I think one of those things, obviously, and this is a personal comment again, is what us wanting an athlete like Ramy with his potential, with his physique, winning the Mr. Olympia. We want to see the best of the best of the best. And of course, every so often, and nearly every Mr. Olympia has had this, You've got years when you go, oh, that was amazing. He took the game to a new level. And another years, oh, that was close. Someone else could have won and stuff like that. And that's even if we're a fanboy. That's even if our preference is for Ramy as Mr. Olympia. Back to you, Steve.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about his diet really quick. We're going to get into a steroid cycle, Mobster.
Yeah.
So his listed stats, Big Ramy, 5'9", 5'8" area. Contest size in the high 200s, 285 up to 295. Off season, he was over 300 pounds. So he's an absolute beast of a bodybuilder with his stats. Not a guy you want to run into in a back alley, all right, when he's in a bad mood. I'll put it that way. So nutrition-wise, it's not really complicated. From the stuff I've seen, the guy was eating a lot of good quality foods. He takes his diet very serious. We're talking eggs, sweet potatoes, rice, chicken breast. Then he adds fruit. Okay, we're seeing this a lot with bodybuilders today, especially in the Middle East bodybuilders. They're not afraid of fruit the way Americans are. In his case, you know, pineapple. Why? Why pineapple? Pineapple, it's a very water-based. It's very good also for the gut and digestion. So if you consume pineapple with your meal, it actually will help with digestion. So it's a great idea to use things like pineapple, papaya. So we see Middle East bodybuilders are not afraid of fruit like other parts of the world. You also have fish in his diet, and then those green veggies that are so elusive. And a lot of bodybuilders don't even consume veggies. It's just not part of their thing. They're like, veggies, you know, it's not going to help me build muscle. Well, veggies are very important because of the vitamins, minerals, the antioxidants, and all that stuff. So it's essential. And then he also messes around with things like peanut butter, almond butter, protein shake here and there. So things like that. So he's trying to get as much protein as he can. We're talking an absurd amount of protein in his diet. So let's talk about his steroid cycle. And one of the things, go ahead, boss. I know you love the Simon. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
One very quick thing. Funny enough, in one of the I think the Friday night interviews that were done, Ramy had met, I can't remember the name of the athlete that was a previous athlete himself. He was interviewing, and Ramy come over and was being interviewed on a Friday. And he actually turned around and said to him, I have 6 meals a day. Ramy, how do you get this amount of volume of food in? How would you manage it? He says, I think I'd probably take the least, talking to the other athletes, I'd probably eat the least amount of sheer volume of food. And he actually said himself on camera, and I believe it's my genetics. So it's an interesting thing there. I don't disagree with a single thing you said in terms of his actual intake and what that would consist of. But Ramy himself turned around and said that he's not doing 6 meals a day. So the fella says, what do you, it's 4 meals, sometimes 5. He says, but I think I eat the least amount of other athletes. And we know that the individual genetics and response to food is one of those things that applies here. So Ramy responds to food and the healthy food that Steve just listed incredibly well. It's probably a little bit like myself. When people go, how big are you, Steve? You go, and I say I'm this 319 pounds at the moment. They think I'm like Desperate Dan, a cartoon character, eating the whole cows with the horns sticking out of pie crust, something like this. And I go, no, I'm probably eating, a little bit more than the average person, but not excessively so. That's down to lifestyle and genetics. And I think Ramy's there as well in terms of what he said on camera, eating less meals, perhaps slightly bigger meals, but less meals. And it's his genetics response to the food is incredibly good. If it's super healthy, he's getting the maximum nutrients out of it, and it doesn't require 10,000 calories a day. Doesn't have to have 6-7 meals a day. But yeah, let's get onto the steroid cycle, Steve, by all means, and see what we think. Maybe even if there's been any changes from last year and what we've discussed till this year. Back to you.
Yeah, so, basically we're talking about nutrition. We have to talk about HGH and insulin. So if you're going to basically take advantage of these meals, it's very important to use both of these compounds. And when you use a lot of HGH, it affects your blood sugar. It sends your blood sugar skyrocketing. So that's why the insulin is so important. So, how much HGH is he using? I would say on a lean day, he's running no more than 8 IUs, probably, up to 20 IUs or more even on certain days. So very, very important that he's constantly getting HGH. Another advantage he has being in the Middle East, because HGH in the Middle East is going to be a lot cheaper and a lot more legit and high quality than HGH you could get in the United States. I mean, his American counterparts are probably spending 5-6 times the amount of money on the HGH that they're getting, and it's not even dose good. So he's very fortunate to be in that part of the world. It gives him the built-in advantage. Now, when you're taking that HGH, like I said, your blood sugar skyrockets. You got to take that insulin to drive it back down. You take the insulin to drive it back down, then you have a big meal. You have one of his meals, a very simple meal, brown rice, veggies, protein, okay? And that gets partitioned into the muscle that allows him to grow. So when he was basically going through that phase, that growing phase where he put on 50, 75, even 100 pounds, he was definitely using the HGH and insulin during that time. The coach he was working with was like, you know what, Big Ramy, you have the genetics to blow up, and you're going to follow my protocol. And in a year from now and 2 years from now, you're going to be a beast. And this is one of the ways that this is one of the keys is the HGH and insulin, using them properly. If you use insulin improperly, you're just going to get fat. But you have to use insulin properly, and you have to have these genetics. You have to know how to eat. You have to meal time, and you have to run a boatload of HGH with it. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. Don't ever run insulin by itself. Huge, huge mistake. Another thing he would have ran, and this is something that bodybuilders today aren't afraid to do because you have access to aromatase inhibitors. There's lots of testosterone, and they're not even scared to run long esters. Once you get closer to the show, you're going to run propionate. When you're away from the show, you're going to run enanthate. Those are the testosterones that they mess around with. Now, how much was he running? I mean, I've heard things up to 5,000 milligrams per week. I think that's ridiculous. I don't believe it. I think it was closer to 1,500 or 2,000 milligrams a week myself.
Yes.
The next steroid is absolutely mandatory for the pro bodybuilders to use. Absolutely mandatory. If they're not using this steroid, they're not going anywhere, and that's Trenbolone. And how much Trenbolone? There's been rumors up to 3,000 milligrams per week. Again, I think that's ridiculous. You got to remember, they're in the Middle East. They're getting access to the best steroids in the world. They don't have to run these excessive dosages. They're not running underdose stuff. I really think he's probably getting, on some weeks, he's hiking it up to maybe 1,500, maybe even 2,000 milligrams per week. It's crazy. It's a crazy dosage. I would die on that dosage. I would be miserable on that dosage. They're not running it though. They're not running it though long term. They're running it for maybe a few weeks, and then they back off on the dose. So for me, even running 250 milligrams a week of Tren makes me miserable on the stuff. But I mean, these guys are doing what they have to do. And again, Tren with the HGH, with the insulin, oh my gosh, that is one of the keys to getting huge. You have to run Trenbolone if you're a professional bodybuilder at that level. Every single guy on that list is using Trenbolone. That's a fact. If you're not going to use Trenbolone, you're not going to make it into the top 10 Mr. Olympia. It's just not going to happen. The last one I want to talk about, I'm going to bring in Mobster for his thoughts on is Equipoise. Equipoise is a really popular one today as well because it's a very mild steroid. You can take it, it boosts, it does all the things that steroids do, okay? But it doesn't aromatize like crazy. It doesn't give you androgenic side effects like crazy. It's just a good mild steroid. So they can run a lot of it, and it's not going to mess with them. It's not going to give them the side effects that other steroids will give them. And it's cheap. It's a cheap steroid, and it does the job. So I've heard things up to 3,000 milligrams per. Again, that's excessive. I think it's probably about half that. He was running somewhere between 1,200, maybe 1,500 milligrams a week. So Mobster, I'll bring you in here and tell us a little bit of some of the other steroids these guys are messing around with today.
I'll touch on that, Steve. If we're still talking about a bulking cycle here, and of course, what happens a great deal, although these were supposed to have come from a trainer oxygen gym in terms of the 2 cycles that we talk about in a previous article, regards the one that made him close to 300 pounds and the one that he used prior to his first New York win, which in terms of actual quality, his quads probably look the best, is that these happen a lot. So we get the, was they bullshitting us? Was the amounts exaggerated? Possibly, because they might have wanted to give the impression to other athletes that this is what you want to take if you want to beat Ramy. And then, of course, as is always the case, I would need literally to see the fella standing in front of me, see his CV, know that he worked at the gym, to know 100% that it was definitely someone that had worked with Ramy, and it was 100% from his mouth that this is supposed to be what Ramy was taking. But this happens all the time. And guys, the reason for that is quite simple, because everybody's convinced that if they do the same cycle as Ramy took, and he went from 200 to 280 pounds on this cycle, then if I do this cycle, I would go from 200 to 280 pounds. And unfortunately, that's not the case. When Steve talks about the lower numbers, it's because he believes this is what someone with Ramy's genetics, with Ramy's frame, with Ramy's background, with the support, etc., is getting in the Middle East. This is how he grew. So I agree with the numbers that Steve's thrown out. One of the drugs on here, which we're going to get into now, is Decadurabolin. A personal favorite of mine, my sus Deca back in the cycle back in the day, is still one of my favorite cycles, especially for bulking. And forget the healing side. That really is almost 9 times out of 10, you're talking about healing stuff in terms of the potential for Deca seems to be mostly in studies and medical uses. And if you're pounding the granny out of your joints, if you're working like a crazy guy that wants to win the Mr Olympia, the stress on your joints, you're probably going to get more tissue repair from the HGH that Steve's already mentioned than you are from the Deca, if at all. The suggested number at the time was 2,000 milligrams. Like Steve already said, the top end for me would be 1,000 if I ever went that high. And I suspect it was probably like that. I'd actually probably want to use a little bit, 500-600 maximum, and they didn't even use that back in the day. So I agree. We can half some of the numbers that's talked about here. Diana Bowl, breakfast of champions, value for per pound that you're going to put on, the weight, etc., the ballooning up, the water retention. And again, we're talking about a bulking cycle here. It's one of the cheapest drugs for the return that you're going to get. Of course, it's an oral, and you have to watch that kind of stuff. And if you look here, we've only got 2 orals on this list. Really, everything else is an injectable. But like Steve says, it's over-the-counter pharma quality, and Christ, it's probably being posted for your letterbox. Free, don't ask no questions, just take it and get on with it. Anadrol. I mean, the number here suggested is really, really high. And I think Steve says properly, when they talk about these cycles, sometimes it's for relatively short periods of time. Some of it's down to your ability genetically to be able to handle these drugs. There's no damn way on earth I would want to be running this drug for months at a time. But the suggested leaked cycle amount was 300 milligrams a day. Steve will tell you the same as what I will. Both the 100 milligrams of D-Bolt is high, and 300 milligrams a day suggested. I was actually go back down to 100 here, Steve. Again, if you've got the genetics of a Big Ramy, perhaps never having done any drugs before when you was a fisherman and joining the gym and being one of the guys that was helping out in the gym, and then I put you on 100 milligrams a day with these other drugs of Anadrol, you're going to blow up. If you've got your genetics once, you're going to blow up. So the idea that he was on 300 milligrams with all these other drugs seems to me to be excessive. One of it is just too big of a hammer for that small of a nail. His response is going to be huge with what we would consider next to nothing. So the idea of these numbers is perhaps what we think someone like Ramy needed to get that big. But if you've seen him at 200 pounds before he blew up, he was a big guy. He looked like a big muscular guy. He could see the muscle bellies. And so it doesn't take ridiculous 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we're talking about 11, 12 grams, 13 grams a week here, Steve. Yeah, 13 grams of just the test and FNA and Equipoise and Deca. 13 grams a week, 13,000 milligrams to get into 2. I don't think so. So the numbers are probably overstated, possibly just to say for the effect of playing with the psyche of those people that are going to read this and maybe compete against him. What I do agree with is there's a suggestion here of a myostatin GDF8 blocking peptide, something you and I have talked about before, both in pre-shows and previous podcasts, and I'm sure you've discussed it in other podcasts with Ricky V, etc., is the idea that the Middle Eastern guys, especially with their pharma drugs, etc., are having better access than Europe, better access than the UK, and better access than the States. And it's certainly, as you've just said it a few minutes ago, at a much lower over-the-counter cost to peptides, and specifically here, something like GDF8, if it works, if it's effective, as an addition to a cycle that's already going great, guys, it's already blowing you up, to inhibit myostatin and essentially keep you growing, keep you recovering. It's going to be one of those things that doesn't necessarily blow you up in and of itself, because you're training, you're breaking down muscle fibers, you're stressing the body, but it stops that degradation. It stops the going backwards. In other words, it's going to kind of allow you to, with the volume that we talked about in training earlier on, to overtrain and recover from overtraining. Whereas without it, you might see difference in the physique. I do want to touch on, Steve, before we finish on a whole cycle stuff. And we know this because of Chav's reputation with regards to his athletes and the difference that he seems to make. There's a few things out there that get discussed. And I think, and obviously we're talking about pre-competition here rather than bulking up through the year and getting back into Mr Olympia shape. And that's two things. One, which doesn't really get discussed that much. I've got to be honest, I'm not an expert on it by any stretch of the imagination. It's so-called plasma expanders. In other words, something that allow the muscle to be filled out, and what might be euphemistically called carbon up. So it's plenty of water and carbohydrates in the muscle cells. And there's no doubt, looking at Ramy, that wasn't an issue. Certainly looked big and full. The other thing will, of course, be use of diuretics. And we know that because of the post-Olympia interviews that have been done with a now retired Ronnie Coleman, discussing stuff that he did with Kevin to lose water. And obviously later on, the whole laying in bed, needing to go to hospital, drinking a gallon of water and then coming on stage, looking a little bit watery, sweating it out and winning the Mr Olympia. So we've discussed in other shows of Top Pros cycles, the use of diuretics. And one of the issues is, for example, mistiming. And this is where I think perhaps arguably this year, Ramy's one small mistake that may have had him looking a little bit tighter and comparable in that particular way in terms of condition with Brandon, and that is possibly the slight mistiming of the diuretic use this year. And again, arguably, one thing that he did do correctly is he didn't follow up by throwing more diuretics, because then we would have had issues off stage. And I've already seen interviews with Ramy and Ramy on video cameras doing press and photo shoots, etc., etc. So that's not the case here. So what we're looking at is that they did, in my opinion, use diuretics, but for whatever reason, he didn't respond in the time scale that they would have liked. So he didn't quite get that condition. Again, I'll say what I said earlier on. So the last 5 minutes of the show, when that last bit of water came out, when he started to look like a Mr Olympia, literally when the condition that we would have liked to have seen appeared, but they didn't fuck up by throwing more diuretics at it ahead of time and, you know, messing his mineral balances up and having him cramp on stage or anything like that. So maybe that's one thing they need to adjust, Steve. Literally play around with his water next year, keep him more training, as I'd previously discussed, slightly less opportunities and distractions, as huge as that might be, and have him focus, for example, have 3 months, get as many opportunities as possible, and then start his build up to the Olympia 3 months after the last one, and make that like a date in your diary, and then adjust in the timing or ever so slightly the amount of diuretics used to dry him out and just have that tiny bit of water from under the skin disappear, and for us to see the grainy look, the condition look that a lot of pundits, ourselves included, would like to see in our Mr Olympia. And if he does that and brings that, I think next year's argument is negated as far as who else could have won. It'll be Ramy and then everybody else, Steve. What do you think?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I don't like make predictions of this. I always laugh on social media. Guys make predictions ahead of the Mr Olympia as if they're in person watching these guys, you know, train in their underwear and stuff. It's like, you know, we don't know. It's really hard. It's hard to predict. That's a nice thing about, you know, this sort of thing. It's unpredictable, and we could have easily seen Brandon Curry win. I mean, it was really tight. It was a really tight
Friday.
So we'll have to see what happens next year. I'm not sure Brandon Curry will come back. So it'll be a question. I want to see, you know, the top 3 next year. That's going to be interesting. You know, what's going to happen with those guys in the top 3? Are they going to come back? You know, are they going to Are they going to fall off? So it's really, really interesting what's going on. Brandon Curry is he's around Ramy's age. He's a year or two older. He's going to be about 39 he'll be about 39 depending when the Mr. Olympia is done. If it's done in the late summer, he'll be 39 next year, so around Mr. Olympia time. So it'll be interesting to see. He'll be almost 40 actually, so it'll be interesting if someone who's almost 40 can still do it. I think Big Ramy, though, he's got 3-4 years ahead of him where he can win it. He can win it. But we got a lot of young guns coming. Watch out.
I was going to agree with you 100% there, Steve. One of the other, changing the subject slightly there, and I've seen this already mentioned on podcast, is that they say that the two young guns, specifically Hunter Labrada and Nick Walker, their game in the next 2 to 3 years, their potential, one of the things that's been said specifically was Hunter improves and gets a little bit dry. And he had the same issue with the Friday night prejudging followed by the Saturday evening show, that he dried out, his belly flattened down, for example. Nick came from the Arnold just 3 weeks previously into the Olympia and still managed a 5th place. That's a lot of competitions in a short period of time, but fortunately young enough. Those two young guns, specifically Hunter was mentioned as a potential Mr. Olympia, a future Mr. Olympia. So yeah, it's one of those things, Steve. We've actually turned around and said that in the last few years of the Mr. Olympia, the average age of the winner has been creeping up from late 30s to early 40s. And if you go back to Arnold's time, for example, you were talking about late 20s. Well, late 20s is where we're talking about Hunter and Nick, mid 25, 26, 27 between the two of them. So yeah, potentially.
Yeah, I think Hunter says he'll be 30 years old next year. So believe it or not,
so 31, 32 could be absolute peak. Nick could probably add another. I mean, his condition could improve ever so slightly again in the next couple of years. It makes the competition a lot tighter. Had he been in the US ahead of time, arguably can't add that much more muscle to his frame. He used to be a 212 athlete. Brandon, will the fire still be there? So let's just take this top 5 again. That's Ramy at number 1, Brandon at number 2, Hadi at number 3, Hunter at number 4, and Nick at number 5. I'm going to say that next year, if Brandon competes, if the heart hasn't gone out of him, and I don't think that it has, we haven't had a chance to find out yet, we're looking at the same top 5, but whether it be in the same order or whether we'll see Hunter and Nick add something to their physiques, which they're young enough to do, whether Hadi can dry out a little bit more, whether Brandon can add a little tiny bit more quality to his legs, and whether Ramy can bring that condition that we all want to see, that we kind of almost saw everything he had to give last year. I think the top 5 is going to be the same, but the numbers are going to move around. I don't know that we're going to bring anybody else in there into that, regardless of how good 6, 7, and 8 are. I don't think we're going to see anybody else come into that mix and change this up. So especially with this, as I say, 2-3 years, I agree with you. Ramy, Brandon, if he's got the heart, Hadi the same. And then Hunter and Nick will improve. They will improve because of their age. It's just a given. What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, we'll have to see. That's definitely. There's going to be lots of things that happen in the next year. There's going to be, we saw in the past year, we're going to see people dying. We're going to see people with controversies. There's all kinds of different things that can happen. So it's really exciting, and we'll definitely, a year from now, I'm sure that we will do a post 2022 show as well. So, all right, Mobster, great show. Take us into the disclaimer.
Right, so just before that, and something that's worth mentioning, guys, ready for the next show that we're talking about, mentioned by Ramy, mentioned by the winner of the Classic Physique, is George Peterson. We're going to be covering this guy. He's very popular with the other athletes, so he's in our next show. That's not so much as a clue as a giveaway. And a disclaimer, as always, please note, we are not doctors, and the opinions that we offer on these podcasts are ours and ours alone. It is our view and based on our experience and views on the topic, which comes from many years. Podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.